Angela was driving home after a long day at work. The sun had just gone down and the streetlights flickered on, painting the road in a soft orange glow. Her car radio was low, playing gentle music, and she thought about the dinner waiting for her at home. It was a quiet evening and the town seemed peaceful, almost sleepy. Angela liked these moments when the world slowed down and she could simply enjoy the drive. But her peace was broken when flashing red and blue lights appeared in her rearview mirror. She frowned, glancing at her speedometer. She wasn't speeding. Her seatbelt was fastened. Everything seemed fine. Still, she carefully pulled her car to the side of the road. Her hand steady on the wheel, she rolled down the window and waited, her heartbeat quickening a little as the officer approached. The man who walked up to her car was tall, with a firm expression that seemed more stern than necessary. His steps were heavy, and his flashlight pointed straight at her face even though the streetlights were bright enough to see clearly. "License and registration," he said in a sharp tone. Angela calmly handed them over. He looked at the documents, then looked back at her with suspicion in his eyes. "Do you know why I stopped you?" he asked. Angela shook her head. "No, officer. I don't." "You looked like you were trying to avoid me back there," he replied quickly, his voice carrying an edge. Angela blinked, surprised. "I was just driving straight home," she explained gently. Her voice was calm, careful. She didn't want to argue. She had learned long ago that keeping steady in tense situations was better than adding fuel to fire. The officer frowned. He leaned closer, as if searching for something wrong in her face or her words. People walked on the sidewalk nearby, slowing down to see what was happening. A couple even stopped, pulling out their phones to quietly record the scene. They whispered to each other, sensing that something felt off. Angela noticed them but didn't react. She kept her eyes on the officer, waiting for him to explain why he had stopped her. Instead, he asked more questions that had nothing to do with driving. "Where are you coming from? What were you doing there? Who do you know in this part of town?" His words were quick, and his tone suggested he already doubted her answers before she even gave them. Angela answered each question politely, never raising her voice. But inside she wondered why he was treating her this way. She had done nothing wrong. Minutes passed, and the crowd around grew larger. The officer's voice grew louder, almost as if he wanted the people nearby to hear. "You're being suspicious," he said firmly. "I think you're hiding something." Angela's calm eyes met his. "I'm not hiding anything, officer," she replied. Her steady tone only seemed to irritate him more. "Step out of the car," he ordered suddenly. Angela hesitated for only a second before obeying. She opened the door, stepped out slowly, and stood with her hands visible at her sides. The officer circled her, speaking as if he was building a case against her right there on the sidewalk. He exaggerated small things like how she paused before answering his questions or how she had taken too long to pull over. Each word he spoke made the bystanders shake their heads in disbelief. They could see what Angela could also feel, that this was not a fair stop. Yet through it all, Angela stayed composed. Her heart beat faster, but her face showed no fear. She had dealt with worse situations before, though no one here knew that. She kept her breathing slow, her posture straight, and her words soft. She knew losing control would only give him more reason to act against her. The officer finally said he was going to take her in. Angela raised her eyebrows slightly. "On what charge?" she asked in a respectful voice. He didn't answer clearly. Instead, he spoke about how her behavior seemed unusual, how he felt she wasn't telling the truth. He twisted her calmness into defiance, her patience into avoidance. The words sounded strong to those who didn't know better, but they held no real truth. The crowd reacted. A woman in the back gasped, whispering, "She hasn't done anything." A man holding his phone muttered, "This isn't right." People began murmuring louder, their voices carrying frustration and concern. The officer glanced at them, his jaw tightening. But he pressed forward with his decision, pulling out handcuffs. Angela felt the cold steel click around her wrists. She looked down at them, then back up, her face unreadable. She did not fight. She did not resist. Instead, she let him lead her toward his patrol car. Her silence was not weakness. It was the silence of someone who knew the truth would soon reveal itself. As the car door closed behind her, she caught the eyes of a young boy standing on the sidewalk with his parents. His eyes were wide, full of confusion. She gave him the smallest nod as if to say, "It's going to be okay." The boy nodded back without fully understanding why. The officer sat in the front seat, proud of himself. He drove off, leaving behind a group of stunned townspeople who couldn't believe what they had just seen. Whispers spread quickly. Phones buzzed as people uploaded the video clips online. Strangers who had never spoken to each other before now shared the same thought. This wasn't just a traffic stop. Something about it was wrong, deeply wrong. Inside the car, Angela leaned back against the seat. Her wrists ached slightly from the cuffs, but she didn't complain. Her thoughts were calm, steady. She looked out the window at the town passing by, the street she knew well, the people she quietly served without them ever knowing. Tonight was not the night she had planned, but she understood that sometimes plans changed, and sometimes unexpected events opened the door for truth to shine brighter than ever. The officer thought he had won, but Angela's silence carried a strength he couldn't see. The night was far from over, and the story had only just begun. The patrol car pulled into the station yard, its headlights cutting across the concrete wall. Angela sat quietly in the back seat, her hands still bound. The officer stepped out with a proud expression, as if he had just solved a great crime. He opened her door and ordered her out. Angela moved slowly, steady in her steps, showing no resistance. The few officers standing nearby glanced curiously. They had not been expecting a new arrest that evening, and the sight of a calm, well-dressed woman in handcuffs raised quiet questions among them. Inside the station, the fluorescent lights buzzed faintly. The officer led Angela to the front desk, handing over her license and paperwork as though he had done something extraordinary. "Suspicious behavior," he announced loudly. "Possible obstruction." His words filled the room, but they carried no real explanation. The desk officer frowned, typing something into the system, then looked up at Angela. She stood tall, her eyes steady, giving no reaction. The officer pushed for her to be booked quickly, his voice still sharp. Another officer, older and quieter, raised an eyebrow. "What exactly did she do?" he asked. The answer he received was vague, full of phrases like acting strange and not cooperating. The older officer didn't argue, but his eyes followed Angela carefully. Something about her presence, her calmness, made him sense this story was not as simple as it seemed. Angela was led through the formal process: fingerprints, photographs, and forms. Each step was done with mechanical efficiency, yet the atmosphere felt tense. The officer who had arrested her spoke too much, his voice filling the silence, trying to make his actions sound justified. Angela listened without interruption, her face showing nothing but patience. She had been through procedures before, though never on this side of the desk. Her silence unsettled him more than anger would have. When she was placed in a holding room, the officer smirked. "You'll think twice next time," he muttered. Angela simply looked at him for a moment and then turned her gaze to the plain wall. She knew there was no use in arguing now. Timing was everything, and her moment had not yet come. Hours passed slowly. The officer strutted around the station, telling the story of his arrest to anyone who would listen. He painted himself as the hero who had stopped someone suspicious before she could cause trouble. A few colleagues nodded politely, but others remained doubtful. They had seen many arrests before, and something about this one didn't add up. The woman in the holding room wasn't nervous, wasn't protesting, wasn't begging for release. Instead, she sat quietly waiting. That patience hinted at something deeper. Finally, she asked for her phone call. Her request was granted, and she dialed a number with steady fingers. Her voice was calm, almost ordinary as she spoke. The words were few. "It's me. At the station. Send someone." She hung up without explaining further. The officer nearby raised an eyebrow. To him it sounded odd, but he brushed it off, thinking she was calling a family member. The night grew darker outside, and the station settled into its usual rhythm. Officers wrote reports, phones rang occasionally, and the hum of machines filled the background. The officer who had brought Angela in grew restless. He checked on her repeatedly, each time expecting to see worry or fear on her face. Instead, she remained composed. She met his stare briefly, then looked away, as though he were no more than a shadow on the wall. His irritation grew. In the early hours, headlights swept across the front windows. A pair of black cars pulled up silently. Men and women in dark suits stepped out, their badges ready in their hands. They walked in with firm strides, their presence commanding attention. The desk officer straightened immediately, recognizing the seriousness of their arrival. The arresting officer looked confused, almost annoyed. "Can I help you?" he asked, trying to sound authoritative. The tallest man in the group held up his badge. His voice was clear. "We're here for Agent Angela Roberts." The entire room froze. The officers looked at each other, disbelief spreading across their faces. The arrogant arresting officer blinked, stunned. "Agent?" he repeated, his voice cracking slightly. "Yes," the suited man replied firmly. "Federal Bureau of Investigation. She's one of ours." Whispers broke out across the station. Some officers looked toward the holding room in shock. Others turned their eyes toward the arresting officer, their expressions sharp with unspoken judgment. The proud smirk that had sat on his face all night vanished instantly. He opened his mouth, but no words came out. The agents walked past him without pause, heading straight for the holding area. Angela rose from her seat as they entered, her calmness unchanged. One of the women smiled slightly at her, a smile of recognition and respect. Angela nodded, stepping forward as they removed the cuffs with swift precision. The cold steel clinked as it hit the table, a sound that cut through the silence of the room. The arresting officer tried to defend himself. "She didn't say who she was," he argued loudly. "She was suspicious. I was just doing my job." But the excuses sounded hollow even to his own ears. Everyone in the room could see the truth now. His pride had led him into a mistake far bigger than he understood. Angela looked at him, her eyes steady. She didn't need to raise her voice. "Sometimes," she said softly, "doing your job means knowing when to stop." The room seemed to hold its breath at her words. They carried more weight than anger ever could. The agents guided her out, their presence filling the station with authority. The arresting officer was left standing alone, his chest tight, his thoughts racing. He had wanted to show power, but now he looked powerless. The other officers turned away from him, focusing instead on the woman who had been wrongly treated. The woman who turned out to be far more than anyone expected. Outside, the night air was cool, and the quiet streets held the weight of the story that was unfolding. The townspeople who had witnessed the arrest earlier still talked among themselves, videos already spreading across phones and social media. And soon, the whole town would know what kind of mistake had been made. Angela stepped into one of the dark cars, the door closing gently behind her. The agents surrounded her with quiet respect. The station lights glowed behind them, but the real story was only just beginning. The following morning, the small town woke to news that spread faster than the sunrise. Clips from the night before were everywhere, on phones, on social media pages, whispered about in coffee shops, and shared in offices. The video showed a woman being handcuffed calmly while a loud officer accused her of vague crimes. But the comments below the videos told the real shock. The woman in the video was not an ordinary citizen. She was an FBI agent, wrongly arrested by a man who thought power was the same as truth. Inside the police station, the atmosphere had shifted completely. Officers whispered in corners, their voices low but filled with disbelief. Some shook their heads, muttering about how reckless the arrest had been. Others said nothing, but their silence spoke loudly. The arrogant officer from the night before walked around with stiff shoulders, trying to look confident, but his face showed the weight of fear. He knew what was coming. Angela, meanwhile, was not at the station anymore. She was at a secure office nearby, sitting across from her colleagues. The room was quiet except for the steady hum of machines. Files were on the table, coffee cups stood half-finished, but the main focus was her. She recounted the incident clearly, step by step, her voice even and calm. She left nothing out but added no extra emotion. It was just the truth, and the truth was powerful enough on its own. Her colleagues listened closely, some shaking their heads in disbelief, others writing notes. The senior agent in the room leaned back in his chair. "You handled it with patience," he said slowly. That officer didn't realize who he was dealing with. But more than that, he showed exactly what happens when someone uses authority carelessly. Angela nodded. She wasn't interested in revenge. She was interested in accountability, in ensuring no one else would face what she had faced the night before. Back at the station, the officer who arrested her was called into the captain's office. The captain's face was firm, his voice controlled but heavy with disappointment. "Do you understand the seriousness of what you've done?" he asked. The officer tried to defend himself again, repeating the same words about suspicious behavior, but the captain cut him off. "Suspicion is not proof. Suspicion is not law. You treated her like a criminal without reason. And she wasn't just any woman, she was an FBI agent. The words struck like a hammer. The officer left the room pale, sweat on his forehead. He had thought himself untouchable, but now every step echoed like a reminder of his mistake. He sat at his desk, staring at his hands, feeling the weight of eyes on him. The respect he once demanded from colleagues had turned into quiet judgment. No one laughed at his jokes, no one asked about his stories. He was alone in a room full of people. Meanwhile, the townspeople continued to talk. The local diner buzzed with voices. A man with a newspaper said, "Did you see that video? Can you believe it?" A woman replied, "She stayed so calm. Most people would have been terrified." Another added, "And she's an FBI agent? That officer's career is finished." Each table carried the same conversation, the same disbelief. The town had seen many arrests before, but none like this. This one revealed more about justice and power than any court lecture could. Later that afternoon, Angela walked through the town briefly with 2 agents beside her. People recognized her immediately. Some smiled, others nodded respectfully. A few whispered her name softly, almost as if she were a figure from a story rather than real life. Angela returned their nods with quiet kindness, but she didn't stop to explain or boast. Her work wasn't about attention, it was about truth. In the courthouse, preparations were already being made. The district attorney's office had received reports, statements, and evidence from the night before. The case was not about Angela being arrested. It was about the officer's behavior, his misuse of authority, and his false claims. Witnesses who had filmed the event were contacted. Their videos became official evidence, each one showing clearly how Angela had done nothing wrong, how she had obeyed every instruction calmly, and how the officer had escalated without reason. The officer, sitting at home that night, scrolled through his phone. Every headline carried his mistake. Every video clip showed his voice growing louder, his handcuffs clicking around her wrists. He felt anger rise in his chest, but it was not anger at himself, it was anger at being caught. Deep down, though, he knew the truth. He had let his pride guide his actions, and now the world was watching. Angela, in her quiet home, sat by the window with a cup of tea. She looked out at the street where children played and neighbors greeted each other. She thought about how easily the night before could have been worse if she had lost her patience or raised her voice. But she had stayed steady. That calmness, she knew, had been her shield. It had allowed the truth to reveal itself without confusion. She didn't think of herself as a hero. She thought of herself as someone who did what was right. The next morning she received a message. The court date was set. It would not be long before the officer stood before a judge to answer for his actions. Angela read the message and placed her phone down. She took a deep breath, ready for what lay ahead. For her, it wasn't about punishment, it was about showing that justice had a place even in small towns. Even in moments where one person thought power could silence truth. The stage was being set for the courtroom. The town waited, the officers waited, the nation, through the spread of videos, waited. And at the center of it all was Angela, the woman who had remained calm in handcuffs, the woman who had turned silence into strength. The story was no longer just hers. It belonged to everyone who had ever wondered if fairness could still win. The day of the court hearing arrived, and the small town felt different. People gathered outside the courthouse, curious to see what would happen. The air carried a mix of whispers, the sound of shoes against stone steps, and the occasional click of cameras from local reporters. Everyone knew this case was not like the others. It was not just about one officer and one woman. It was about power, fairness, and truth standing face to face. Angela arrived quietly with her colleagues beside her. She was dressed in simple professional clothes, her expression calm as always. She did not look like someone seeking revenge. She looked like someone who trusted the process, someone ready to let truth speak for itself. The crowd turned their heads as she walked past, some nodding respectfully, others simply watching in awe. To many, she was already a symbol of dignity. Inside the courtroom, the benches filled quickly. Townspeople, reporters, and even people from nearby cities came to see it. The officer entered next, his steps slower than usual. The confidence he had shown on the night of the arrest was gone. His eyes darted around, avoiding the cameras, avoiding the faces that seemed to judge him without words. He sat down at the defense table, shifting uncomfortably in his chair. The judge entered, and the room fell silent. Papers rustled softly as lawyers prepared their notes. The district attorney stood to present the case. His voice was steady, clear, and precise. "This is a case of misconduct, misuse of authority, and false reporting," he began. His words echoed through the room, carried by the stillness of those listening. He explained how the officer had stopped Angela without cause, escalated the situation, and created false claims in his report. Then came the evidence. Screens lit up as videos recorded by bystanders were played one after another. The room watched as Angela's calm face appeared on the screen, answering questions politely, stepping out of her car without resistance, and standing still as handcuffs were placed on her wrists. The videos showed everything: the officer's sharp voice, his exaggerated accusations, and Angela's steady silence. Gasps rose from the audience as the reality unfolded in front of them. The defense attorney tried to argue that the officer was simply cautious, that he had acted on suspicion for safety. But the videos told a different story, and so did the witnesses. People who had been on the street that night stepped forward. One woman said, "I watched the whole thing." She didn't argue. She did everything he asked. He just kept pushing. Another man added, "I filmed because it didn't feel right." She was calm. He wasn't. Their voices were simple but strong, carrying more truth than any polished speech. Angela was called to the stand. She walked forward slowly, sat down, and placed her hands gently on the table. Her voice, when she spoke, was soft yet firm. She described the night from her view, how she had been driving home, how the officer had accused her without reason, how she had stayed calm through every step. She did not raise her voice, she did not add dramatic words. She simply told the truth. The courtroom hung on every word, not because it was loud, but because it was real. Then came the moment that shook the room. The district attorney asked, "Ms. Roberts, could you please state your occupation for the record?" Angela looked directly ahead.
"I am a federal agent with the Federal Bureau of Investigation," she said clearly.
For a moment, silence filled the courtroom. People exchanged looks, some gasping softly. The officer's face went pale. He shifted in his seat, his hands clenching tightly together. The truth was now spoken openly, impossible to ignore. The judge leaned forward slightly, his eyes narrowing. "An FBI agent?" he repeated, as though needing to hear it twice. Angela nodded once. "Yes, Your Honor," the district attorney continued. "So not only was the defendant's arrest baseless, but it was also an unlawful act committed against a federal officer in the line of her own duties." His words carried weight, each one landing heavily on the ears of everyone present. The officer's defense crumbled quickly. His lawyer tried to argue again, but the judge raised a hand. "The evidence is clear," the judge said firmly. The videos, the witnesses, the testimony. This was not caution. This was misconduct. The tension in the room grew as the judge prepared to deliver his words. Reporters leaned forward, pens ready. The townspeople held their breath. The officer stared at the table, unable to meet anyone's eyes. Finally, the judge spoke. "This court cannot overlook the seriousness of this act. Misuse of authority damages not only the victim, but the trust of the public. When an officer chooses pride over justice, it is the law itself that suffers. And in this case, the victim was not only an innocent woman, but a federal agent serving this nation. The court finds the defendant guilty." The words rang out, final and undeniable. The officer's head dropped lower. The courtroom erupted in whispers, some gasps, and even quiet claps before the judge called for order. The judge continued. "Considering the weight of this misconduct, this court delivers the harshest sentence permitted under the law." The officer's shoulders sagged as the gavel struck the block. His career, his reputation, and his freedom, all of it collapsed in that single moment. Angela sat still, her face calm. She had not come for revenge. She had come for truth, and truth had been spoken. As she stepped down from the stand, people looked at her with respect. Some smiled softly, others nodded, but none spoke loudly. They understood that dignity did not need noise. Outside the courthouse, the crowd buzzed with energy. Reporters shouted questions, cameras flashed, but Angela moved past them quietly. She had no interest in fame. She wanted only to return to her work, to her life, and to let this case be a lesson. Her silence was more powerful than any speech she could have given. The officer was led away in handcuffs, his head bowed. For the first time, he understood the feeling of being powerless, of being judged for actions he could not defend. The very sound of the cuffs echoed back the same steel he had once placed on Angela's wrists. The circle was complete. As Angela walked to her car, a little girl in the crowd waved shyly. Angela noticed her and smiled, giving a small wave back. That single moment showed more about justice than all the shouting and arguments had before. It was a reminder that strength can be gentle, and truth can be quiet yet unstoppable. The story of the courtroom spread far beyond the town. News outlets carried it, social media lit up with clips, and people across the country discussed what had happened. Many saw it as a warning, others as hope. But for Angela, it was simply a step forward, another day where truth had won. When the gavel struck for the last time, the courthouse began to empty slowly. People spoke in hushed tones, shaking their heads at what they had just witnessed. Some still couldn't believe it. An ordinary evening had turned into one of the most unforgettable stories the town had ever seen. The officer who once walked with pride was now taken away in silence, while the woman he had tried to humiliate walked out with her dignity intact. Angela stepped outside the heavy wooden doors, and the sunlight touched her face. It felt almost like a quiet blessing after the storm she had endured. Reporters called her name, asking questions about how she felt, what she thought, and what her next steps would be. She didn't stop to answer. She kept walking steadily, her gaze forward, her pace calm. To her, the truth was enough. It didn't need to be repeated in microphones or twisted into headlines. She reached the car waiting for her, but before getting in, she paused. Across the street stood a group of townspeople who had come to watch the trial. Some waved politely, others simply stood still with looks of respect on their faces. Angela gave them a small nod, acknowledging their support. She didn't need applause. Just that quiet connection was enough. The agents who had accompanied her opened the door and she stepped inside. As the car drove away, she looked out the window, watching the courthouse grow smaller in the distance. Her thoughts drifted, not to revenge or anger, but to the larger meaning of what had happened. One mistake by a man who misused his power had revealed an important truth, that no one, no matter their position, was above the law. Back at the police station, silence lingered like a heavy shadow. Officers sat at their desks trying to continue their work, but their minds were elsewhere. They remembered the courtroom, the judge's stern words, the videos replayed again and again. For many of them, it was a wake-up call. Authority was not a weapon. It was a responsibility. And when it was misused, the damage spread far beyond one person. It broke trust in the whole system. The captain addressed his team that evening. His voice was firm. "Let this be a lesson to all of us," he said. "We are here to protect, not to intimidate. We are here to serve, not to boast. If we forget that, then we have no right to wear this uniform." His words stayed with them long after the meeting ended. Meanwhile, Angela returned to her own duties. She didn't take days off to rest or seek attention. The very next week, she was back to working on her cases, traveling, meeting with colleagues, and doing the quiet but important work she had always done. For her, the courtroom had been a chapter, not the whole story. She believed in moving forward, not staying stuck in one moment of pain. The town, however, continued to talk about her. At the diner, people told the story to newcomers. In schools, teachers used it as an example of why honesty mattered more than appearances. Parents told their children that calmness could be more powerful than shouting, that patience could be stronger than force. The story became a lesson, passed from one person to another, shaping the way people thought about justice. Social media carried the story far beyond the town. News anchors discussed it on television. Bloggers wrote about it online, and people everywhere shared their opinions. Some admired Angela's calmness, others were shocked by the officer's actions, and many found hope in the outcome. They said it showed that even when things seemed unfair, truth could still rise. The officer, now behind bars, had plenty of time to think. At first he was bitter, blaming everyone but himself. But as days turned into weeks, the silence of his cell forced him to reflect. He remembered Angela's face when she had spoken to him in the station, her words about knowing when to stop. Slowly, those words echoed louder than his own anger. He realized too late that pride had cost him everything: his job, his freedom, and his respect. Angela, on the other hand, carried no bitterness. She didn't smile at his downfall, nor did she celebrate his punishment. To her, justice wasn't about crushing someone. It was about balance, about showing the world that truth had weight and meaning. She believed that lessons were not only for those who suffered, but also for those who caused the suffering. In her heart, she hoped he would learn and change, even if it took years. One quiet evening, Angela visited the same street where it had all started. The lamppost glowed softly and the road stretched ahead like it always had. She parked her car and sat for a while, remembering that night. She thought of the flashing lights in her mirror, the loud voice at her window, the cold steel on her wrists. But she also thought of the calmness she had held on to, the patience that had carried her through, and the truth that had set everything right. As she sat there, a young boy walked by with his parents. He stopped suddenly, tugging at his mother's hand. "That's her," he whispered. Angela smiled, recognizing him as the same child she had nodded to on the night of the arrest. She waved at him again, and this time his face lit up with joy. The boy waved back eagerly, his parents smiling in quiet gratitude. For Angela, that simple exchange meant more than all the headlines in the world. The night breeze was cool as she finally drove away, the town lights twinkling behind her. The chapter had closed, but the memory remained, not as a wound but as a lesson. She knew life would bring more challenges, more tests of patience and strength, but she also knew that calmness and truth were stronger than fear or pride. Her story was now a part of the town's history, a reminder etched into the hearts of those who had witnessed it. It was told not as a tale of anger, but as a tale of dignity, not as a story of defeat, but of quiet victory. And every time it was told, it carried the same message. Authority may shout loudly, but truth speaks louder, and in the end, truth always wins.